Hello, so today I will be discussing the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So the model itself is pretty simplistic, however it gives us a basic understanding of the business cycle and how demand and supply shocks can influence the market. It's made up of three curves which we will further discuss. The aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the price level of goods and total spending on domestic goods, where the price level in the economy, we use a GDP deflator or a CPI. It basically measures total spending in the economy, including consumers, businesses, governments, and net exports. So there are three reasons for the aggregate demand curve to be downward sloping. This is one, because of the wealth effect. If price levels do increase, the average person is less wealthy and will therefore spend less, as well as the interest rate effect. If the money market shifts right, this is because there will be an increased demand for liquid money. This will increase the interest rates and it will push down investments. And the third reason being that if money market shifts right again, interest rates will increase and it will appreciate the exchange value of currency, which will ultimately lead to a fall in consumption and net exports. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is the relationship between price levels and business planned production in the short run. So we always assume this to be horizontal in this model because we assume that for any given price level, businesses will supply any amount. And this is because we use the Keynesian theory that assuming prices and wages are sticky. So if consumers do demand more, suppliers will supply that amount without increasing the prices. So the long-run aggregate supply is the relationship between price levels and business plan production in the long run. So in the long run, when prices and wages are flexible, and they've adjusted to any shocks in the market. So we say that in the long run, prices will always return to equilibrium, and therefore we can conclude that GDP in the long run will be equal to potential GDP, which is why this curve is vertical at potential GDP. So just a quick note here, there will be two different equilibrium, one in the short run and one in the long run, because there are two different curves for the aggregate supply. So we'll talk about the two different types of shock, the demand shock and the supply shock. So when there's a demand shock, this is a shock in the aggregate demand, and it occurs when there's an event that impacts the spending. So this again can be government spending, consumer investment, business spending, or the net exports, and it's not related to the price level, because if there's a change in price level for either the demand or the supply shock, it will be a movement along the curve and not a shift in the curve. So back to the shocks, if for example there's an overall wealth increase or consumer confidence or anything that could potentially increase or decrease spending, this will have an impact on the shock. A positive shock is a shift right and it's good for the economy, and negative shock is a shift left and it's bad for the economy. Supply shock is events that can impact businesses in an economy and their ability to supply the economy. So instead here we're going to have a positive shock being a shift down and a negative shock being a shift up. So the example question here is to assume that the economy is initially at potential GDP. What happens to the Canadian business cycle when the stock market crashes as it did during March of 2020 due to COVID-19? So what will happen is that in the short run, the aggregate demand curve will shift left because the overall wealth will decrease, since the money that was once in the stock market has now been decreased, and therefore the consumer spending will also decrease. This will be a negative demand shock and prices will not change because we assume them to be sticky, but the real GDP will decrease to where we see the green circle at Y2, and that will be the short run equilibrium versus the long run equilibrium where prices adjust for such shocks. Thank you for listening. These are the citations.